Welcome. We're delighted that you could be here with us tonight. I am Dr. Crystal Downing, and I am the co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center with my husband, C.S. Lewis scholar David C. Downing. And we are so excited to be able to introduce you to Patti Callahan and her newest C.S. Lewis-inspired novel, Once Upon a Wardrobe. But before I introduce Patti, I want to make several announcements. First, be sure your cell phones have been muted. And second, some of you may be here because you are adoring fans of Patti Callahan, but you've never heard of the Wade Center before. So let me just in one sentence explain what the Wade Center is. We are the preeminent archive in the world for published and unpublished materials by and about C.S. Lewis and 6 of his most important British influencers, like Tolkien and then my area of specialization, Sayers. Second, some of you may already be familiar with the Wade and also know about our predecessor, Christopher Mitchell. And if so, we want to call your attention to another book launch that's happening a week from tonight over in the Wade Building on Washington and Lincoln, where a collection of essays in honor of Chris Mitchell was put together in order to celebrate his 20-year service to the Wade as director. Third, put on your calendars January 20th. On that evening, another Thursday evening, we will be hosting a lecture about C.S. Lewis's reception in America. A lot of people don't realize that C.S. Lewis got famous in America before England. And this lecture is the first of a series of 3 and is by the most respected and famous Christian historian living today, Mark Noll. So those of you in the area will want to join us for that. But now, for the most exciting announcement of all, I have the honor of introducing Patti Callahan. In addition to being a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of 16 novels, Patti is the Harper Lee Distinguished Writer of the Year for 2020, and that's big. I taught college English for over 20 years, and every single college student adores Harper Lee. Many of you are here because you loved Patti's first C.S. Lewis-inspired novel, Becoming Mrs. Lewis, a bestseller that was honored in 2019 with not only the Alabama Library Association Book of the Year Award, but also the Christie Award, which was established in 1999 to celebrate novels that endorse Christian faith in imaginatively intelligent ways. And it is Becoming Mrs. Lewis that introduced Patti to us. David and I had recently started our jobs as Wade directors the summer of 2018 when we were approached about the possibility of hosting the launch of a novel about C.S. Lewis's wife, Joy Davidman. Learning that the author was already a New York Times bestseller, and better yet, that she had done research at the Wade about Lewis and Davidman in order to write her novel, we wholeheartedly endorsed the idea. And it's one of the best decisions we have made as Wade directors. Since then, numerous lovers of Becoming Mrs. Lewis who missed the launch in December of 2018 have agonized over the fact that they could could have met the author of the amazing novel. And amazing because it refuses to either vilify the former communist divorcee that Lewis married, or to overly idealize this woman that Lewis credited with giving him the happiest years of his life. By writing in the first person as Joy Davidman, Patti gives us a complex character, a lover of Christ and Lewis, who is as flawed as every single one of us. It was a brilliant coup de grace. So brilliant that HarperCollins chose to publish Patti's second Lewis-inspired work as the inaugural novel for a brand new fiction imprint. And this is the novel we are launching tonight. What a privilege and honor that Patti chose the Wade Center at Wheaton College to debut what is certain to be another bestseller, Once Upon a Wardrobe. Here is what a reviewer for the Washington Post said just yesterday about the novel. Once Upon a Wardrobe is a beautiful follow-up to Becoming Mrs. Lewis. It's a love letter to books and stories with a meaningful message. The characters learn that fantastical tales are more than mere ways to appease young children. Stories are nourishment for the souls that need joy the most. And sometimes they're the only thing that can help us understand life. Before Patti takes the podium, let me explain how the evening will progress. After she talks about and reads from her brand new novel, my Wade co-director and I will join her on the stage for a brief conversation about her writing process. Then we will open up questions from the audience, and all you need to do is make your way to one of the two microphones that are set up in the aisles. Or if you have trouble getting there, tell your question to someone sitting next to you who can make it to the microphone, and Patti will be glad to answer whatever questions you have. Afterwards, Patti will sign books in the foyer that you can buy with either check or credit card. And also in the foyer, we have not only water bottles available for your refreshment, but also brochures about the Wade, and especially its podcast. And you'll notice we have a flyer about the Wade podcast, which has, in less than 3 years, we have over 75,000 listens in over 100 countries, several of them predominantly Muslim countries. And this is very exciting because we're just talking about how the Wade authors, these C.S. Lewis and these people who influenced him, who brought him to faith, can ignite our imaginations and think about our faith in new ways. So, with no further ado, I introduce my friend, and what a privilege it is to use that word, my friend, Patti Callahan.
Thank you, love. It's so odd hearing somebody talk about you while you stand in the back of the thing. Is that me? Is that what she's talking about? Can y'all hear me well? I feel like we should just get in a big circle. I know it's COVID and we're supposed to spread out, but all right. I'm so excited to talk to you about this book, but I'm even more excited for us to have conversation in a little bit, so be thinking about what you want to ask about. All right, I feel like I'm a teacher at school. Everybody turn to page 7. All right, the year is 1950, and in a small stone cottage in the town and village of Worcester, you think I would have chosen a village I could pronounce, but that's the village that came to me. On the River Severn, a small boy named George lives with his family. He's ill, and he loves to read. And he has found a brand new book that burst onto the scene exactly 71 years ago this week. It was called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And he read that book back to front and front to back. He tried to pop out the back of his wardrobe in his bedroom and reach the magical land of Narnia. He has a sister named Megs, and Megs is a math and physics genius. She attends Oxford University. She is 17, and she attends Somerville in my homage and nod to Crystal Hurd and Dorothy L. Sayers. And she comes home for the weekend. And when she gets home, George tells her about this book, this little slim volume that is brand new in the world, that has a lion on the cover. And she says, "That's nice, George. It's a nice children's book." And he says, "No, it is so much more than a children's book. You have to listen to me. This is really important. And I know that the author of this book teaches at your university. I want you to track him down, and I want you to ask him where this magical land came from." She says, "Absolutely no way. The world is founded on math and physics, and Einstein is going to prove the theory of everything, and we're going to have a single equation that explains who we are, because that is what we are." She is logic-driven. She is trying to make sense of a world that right now to her feels meaningless. And he persists and is relentless, and so she agrees to track down the author and ask him where Narnia came from. She does find Lewis, and she asks him, expecting a simple answer that she can take home to her brother. She wants just a little neat package that she can take home to him, and she can tell him where Narnia came from. I just don't want to talk too long. And instead, Lewis doesn't do what I expected as the writer, and what she doesn't expect as the asker of this question. Instead of answering her with a simple take-home answer, he starts to tell her stories. Stories of his life. Light stories, dark stories, stories of despair and brokenness, and stories of great happiness. And Megs starts to see that maybe, she's not sure yet, but maybe the ordinary, through the alchemy of story, can be transformed into the extraordinary. And she and her brother George set off on some adventures. So that's what the book is about. But the title, Once Upon a Wardrobe, you'll find out why when you read it. But when I say the words, once upon a time, don't you lean forward? Want to know what happens next? There's a joke that in the North we say, once upon a time, and in the South we say, you are not going to believe this. I'm in the Billy Graham Center, I'm not going to say it. But that is because we are made for story. We are quite literally wired for story as humans, as God's creation. Our brains, all 86 billion of them in this dark cave of our head, of our skull, is after one thing, and that's control and meaning. We are constantly searching for meaning. We are constantly trying to make meaning out of what might seem meaningless. And that is why we are made for story. We've been telling stories since the beginning of time as humans. We've been telling stories since before we could speak. We drew them on cave walls. So why in the opening pages then, we know why, Lewis says to his goddaughter Lucy, someday, may you someday be old enough to read fairy tales again. What does he mean old enough? Is that a typo? Did he mean young enough? Is there this kind of, we're young enough to read them, and then there's this squishy middle where we don't read them, and then we're old enough to read them? And I will never feign to say what Lewis meant. I will not try to define for him what he meant. But throughout history, fairy tales and myths have endured and have defined and have explained our lives. Fairy tales have been called many different things through the years. Dream tales, they have been called wonder tales, and as Oscar Wilde called them, beautiful, untrue things. So we have always used fairy tales in our world. And for me, I come back from a fairy tale a little bit different, maybe a little bit braver, maybe a little bit wiser. We learn lessons from them because the children in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, they come back and they discover that they are queens and kings in another world. And who doesn't want to walk through a door and discover that we aren't just ordinary, but we are divine kings and queens meant for another world? And that is what fairy tales do for us. And a couple weeks ago, actually last week, but what is time anymore during COVID? Last week I wrote an essay for Parade magazine on why fairy tales are still important. And don't panic, I'm not going to read you the whole thing. But I want to read you one little part that I wrote. If we want to argue that fairy stories are too fanciful, can we be reminded that the best of these tales don't deny darkness or sorrow or loss, but they do offer what Tolkien calls the consolation of a happy ending. In other words, we get both, the light and the dark, the magical and the real, the good and the bad. We get the fairy godmother and the evil stepmother. We get the wolf in grandma's clothes and the wish-granting white stag. We get the wolf in grandma's clothes, I said that. We get the terrifying woodlands and we get the happy ending. So for me, fairy tales and stories and myths have always been meaning-making. They have always meant something in our world. And then there are certain stories that endure. They endure for generations, and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is one of them. Because even if you've never read it, and if you're here tonight, you've probably read it, but even if you've never read it, you know who Aslan is, right? You know who the White Witch is. And that is because it has endured through generation after generation. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe has somehow entered our universal consciousness. It has somehow come to mean more than just a story. So where do stories like that come from? How are they made out of nothing? I have been long fascinated with origin stories. When I was in high school, I was very cool. I was in the Latin club. That is how you make a lot of friends. But it was one of the best things I ever did, because not only was I forever enduringly fascinated with words and the origin of words and what they mean and where they came from, but I learned about mythology and how stories are built on stories are built on stories. And every culture in the world has an origin story, where we came from, why we're here. How did the sun end up in the sky and the rivers end up where the rivers ended up? Before we could have logic to explain it, we had stories to explain it. And so I was interested in the origin story of Narnia. Where did it come from? How did it just show up out of nothing? And how do we explain it? So when I was writing Becoming Mrs. Lewis, I saw all these little crumbs in Lewis's life that I could see in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I am not a Lewis scholar, and I am definitely not a Chronicles scholar, not like David C. Downing, which is why I am going to bring him up here. But I am a lover of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And as I was doing a deep dive into the years that Jack and Joy fell in love, I could see these moments in his life, and I had never heard about it. I had never had anybody tell me, when he visited Dunluce Castle as a child, he eventually turned that into Cair Paravel. Now, if I had been studying some of the, scholarly books on Narnia, I might have read that. But my forte, my world is fiction. It is story. And there wasn't a story that told me that story. But I tucked it away, And after Mrs. Lewis, I wrote another book. It's called Surviving Savannah. It's about a shipwreck. It's set in Savannah. It could not be any farther from England than it is. And yet this little germ of an idea would not leave me alone. This idea that there were these crumbs in Lewis's life that turned into a full-blown story and world. And I finally found this desire that I wanted to tell it, that I wanted to show you how there are crumbs and pieces of an author's life that show up in a story. And yet simultaneously, there are these large swaths of story source that are completely ineffable, completely mysterious, and even mystical. And how do we explain those? We can't put those in an index in the back of a book. We cannot list those as a logical order. We have to be able to feel those. And we feel things through story. We are not changed by logic. Hardly has a heart ever been turned with a list of facts. Our hearts are turned by story. So I found this desire to write this story. And I was set out to head on book tour for the paperback of Becoming Mrs. Lewis in March of 2020, when that little thing happened. And everything fell like dominoes. And my graduate school son came home from graduate school. My college-age son came home from college. And my husband came home from work. And we were all in one house, sharing one Wi-Fi, and all trying to work. And I needed somewhere to go, and this book became the still point in a madly burning world. Every day, I could visit England and Oxford and the kilns and Magdalen and Meg's and George and the river. I could write about story and transformation, and I could spend my day with this young boy. So as I sat down to try and figure out how to tell this story, I chose the 7 moments of Lewis's life that I wanted to show. And David and I will talk about, because I'm very curious, and Crystal, what moments in his life they would have chosen. But these are the 7 moments I chose because I wanted to show you. But how do I show this? How do I not lecture you? How do I not just have Lewis say, well then, when I was 7, and that's boring. I don't want to read that. So I spent a long time trying to find my way, and what ended up happening was Lewis tells the stories to Megs. Megs writes them in a notebook, and Megs reads them to George. And we see these moments in the author's life through the innocence, naivety, and liminal space of an 8-year-old's eyes. Instead of me telling you that Lewis used to hide in the attic with his brother Warnie in the little end room where there was a wardrobe carved of wood by his grandfather, and make up a land called Boxen, full of talking animals and foreign lands and battles and ships and harbors, instead of telling you that, George is in the attic. He is sitting at the window in the little end room looking out over Belfast Bay. And that is how I decided to tell the story. But meanwhile, Megs is having her own adventures, having her own life, coming to her own realizations. And while I was writing this, it hit me at about 3/4 of the way through, which is usually when one of 2 things happens. My friend Allison Hemmer is an author, and she is here, and she will attest. About 3/4 of the way through, maybe half, one of 2 things happens. You're lost, and you want to give up, and you see a sparkly thing out of the corner of your eye that is a much, much better idea. Or you go, oh oh my gosh, look what's happening. And what I realized about 3/4 of the way through was that Megs and George were representing two polar opposites. One of the cool things I learned in Latin was that although we have only one word for word, the root words, there are two, mythos and logos, logic and myth. And it hit me that George and Megs were these two archetypes of logic and myth, and that they were both planting their flags in these two places and couldn't reconcile one to the other. George believed that only imagination mattered, and his sister Megs believed that only logic could explain it. So what do we do when we have two opposing forces and they become either or, and we want to make them and both? Two things. One, we bring in a third, which is what I do, with a young man named Patrick. And he comes in as a third force to start to reconcile these two opposing forces. And the other is love. Because as much as they each want to plant their flag in these two different places, they love each other greatly. So that is what the story is about. But for me, I remembered this quote that Lewis wrote, and I bet David or Crystal can tell me, Dr. Downing and Downing, can tell me is where it came from, but he says, he once wrote that, parts of me are still a child. And I love that because I feel as if that is the part of himself he tapped into when he wrote Narnia, the parts of his childhood that were painful, the parts of his childhood that he wanted to alchemize and change and shift and transform into a magical world. This is a man who knew not only how to sneak past our watchful dragons, but how to take something that can seem meaningless and make it meaningful. And when during the pandemic, that is what this story did for me. So this is the last paragraph in my essay. As I walked through the wardrobe door to write Once Upon a Wardrobe, I realized once again that it is imagination that often delivers the truth. The enchanted realm is where some of our answers might wait. Beyond princesses in castles and princes on white horses, beyond thorny roses and through castle gates, past a white witch and with a fawn, as we lean forward into the words once upon a time, we might find a truth we never saw in our to-do list of logical answers. As the Irish poet and philosopher John O'Donohue once wrote, a book is a path of words which take the heart in new directions. And that is what I long to show you with Once Upon a Wardrobe. And my editor and publisher at Harper Muse, Amanda Bostic, once said to me, I've always believed that if we can find our way to Narnia, we can find our way home. So I'm going to read just a tiny bit, only because the Downing doctors are making me, and then we are going to have a really great conversation. But I'm going to read a couple different scattered parts for a couple reasons. One is, I just spoke about how there are certain stories and myths that endure, and we can't always explain why. Why did The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe endure way past another children's story? Why did that enter our consciousness? And everybody here will have a different answer because there isn't one answer. But I wanted Megs to be thinking about that. So when you first meet her, she says this. There was once, and is even now, a city on the banks of the river Cherwell. A city as abundant with timeless tales as any city in the world. The slow river begins its journey in Helidon and meets its destiny in the Thames at Oxford. A city of stone towers and gleaming spires, where this story and many others begin. Some stories imagined in this ancient place of Oxford rise above the others. They ascend from the towers, from the quiet libraries and single rooms, from the museums and the cobblestone streets. Some of those stories become legends, myths, tales that are as much a part of us as our bones. And that is how I felt when I started this story, that there are certain tales that rise above the others, and let's try to tap into why. So I'm going to introduce you to George, just a little bit. December 1950. George Henry Devonshire is only 8 years old, and he already knows the truth. They don't have to tell him. The heart he was born with isn't strong enough, and they've done all they can. And by they, he means the doctors and the nurses, his parents, and his older sister, Megs. If they could save him, if they could give their own life for him, they would. He knows that too, but they can't. The December snow outside his bedroom window piles up like wave upon wave of white. George sits up in bed, propped against the forever plumped by his mum pillows. Next to him is a dark oak table with pill bottles and a glass of water and a gone cold cup of tea that his mom left behind. Among all of that clutter is a book, just published, called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. It has a lion on the cover, and George often looks to this lion as if it might hold the key to all he desires to know. And there is so very much he wants to know. George once thought that if he lived long enough to be a grown-up, he'd have all the answers. Now he believes adults don't know what's what any more than he does. But the man who wrote this book, this storybook that takes George out of his bedroom and into Narnia, this man knows something. What that something might be is a mystery. And I'm going to introduce you to Megs after she finally tries to track down Lewis. And she is nervous to meet him, and she is hiding in the backyard of the kilns. I've been sitting in these woods behind his brick house for 3 evenings in a row, trying to screw up the courage to speak to him. So far, that screw hasn't turned far enough. I've nearly decided to invent a tale and answer for George, tell him that Narnia came from a great box of ideas that Mr. Lewis keeps in his study. I will tell George that Mr. Lewis is magical and has his own sources that he refuses to reveal. But I can't lie to George. I never have, and I'm not about to start now. This afternoon, I rode the bus to the kilns. And now I stare over the rolling and hilly acreage, thick with fir and alder, lumpy with boulders and tree stumps. The kilns feels a world away from university. It isn't Narnia. I'm not so deluded to believe I can walk onto the author's property and find a spired castle and a white witch. But there is a lamppost or two along the way, and the trees do indeed appear as if they might house sleeping dryads. The frozen lake could be where Lucy ran across with Mrs. Beaver. That is, if you look at it through squinted eyes. Through the still air, I've heard the voices of the people who live in the author's house, and I've come to differentiate them. There are 2 Lewis brothers and a man named Paxford, whose voice has such a quick, drilling sound I can barely distinguish his words. He keeps the land planting and cutting and cleaning. Twice he's walked near me and hasn't seen me hiding. His hands are large, and I was mesmerized as he cut down a branch that blocked the view to the small lake. C.S. Lewis is called Jack. His brother is called Warnie. I don't know his real name. I suspect these brothers, despite being quite old to me, would understand why I sit on their land and huddle on their rock, because they seem to love each other the way George and I love each other. They would understand my grief and my fear. But maybe they will never really know how I feel, because trespassing does not seem the best way to begin a friendship. I've only seen them once. The first 2 times I came, I stayed for hours. Each hour, my courage only grew the tiniest bit, as my toes got colder by quite a lot. Soon I would become brave enough to call out their names and blab out the question I have come to ask. Where did Narnia come from? My brother, he needs to know. But I'm a coward. The afternoon sun moves behind a bank of clouds, flat and low, and the woods start to turn to shadow shapes. Trees, bushes, and rocks on the white ground appear like cutouts in lace. I think of how the author must have found some of his fantasy land in this place, because I think I can see it too. I can almost imagine Mr. Tumnus ambling from behind a rock, or the great Aslan setting his huge lion paws on the ground as it shakes with majesty. My attention wanders, I let my vigilance flag, and a voice shocks me from my reverie. Well, hello there. I startle and slip from the rock, landing softly in the deep snow. My legs askew and my arms behind me, I must appear to be quite crazy. A man, I see it as the author's brother Warnie, is looking down at me. I'm so sorry, I say, as I rearrange my limbs to stand. The man holds out his leather-gloved hand, and I take it, and he pulls me up. Are you all right? I am. Please don't be angry. I'm sorry I'm trespassing. I was just sitting here thinking I wasn't doing anything wrong, I promise. My words tumble out on top of each other. He bursts into a laugh so powerful that the trees seem to shake with his shoulders. I doubt you are here to do harm. Now that he's up close, I can see him clearer. He's tall, with a jolly face and a shaggy mustache. Above his ruddy nose are brown eyes. A tweed hat sits low, and his body is covered with layers of coats and sweaters. All about him is the aroma of pipe, smoke, and wood fire. He looks at once both jolly and sad. Don't be so sorry. I'm Warren Lewis, and you are? I am Meg's Devonshire. Is there something you're looking for? Are you lost? No, I know where I am, and I'm here on purpose. I was looking for Narnia. It is the stupidest thing to say. A grown woman claiming such a thing. The heat of embarrassment crawls beneath my woolen coat and up my neck. I mean, yes, we've had this happen before. His voice radiates kindness, and he doesn't seem to be chiding or humoring me at all. I brush the snow from my coat and clap my hands together to remove the snow from my mittens. I'm not a fool. I know there's no real Narnia. It's just for my brother. He wants to know how it started. He's sick. Nothing is coming out right. If I had made plans, if I'd thought it all through as I did my math problems, this wouldn't be happening. Your brother is ill. His eyebrows drop and his lips form a straight line. Very. I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do? Yes, there actually is. I dig up the brave light hidden deep inside my fathoms of awkwardness, and I tell him, because what if there isn't another chance? He wants to know where Narnia came from. He needs to know, sir. He is 8 years old, and he won't see 9. He asked me to find out. I'm his only sister, and he asked me. I have to find out for him, but I don't quite know how. So I've been sitting here on this cold boulder on your land, hoping to figure it out. Well, I know just the man can tell you, my brother, Jack. That's it. Y'all are awesome. That's the first time I read that much out loud. I actually started getting choked up. I just love those two people. So we're going to come over here and have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up. So y'all think about what you want to talk about. Do you guys want one of these? Oh, you have waters. Yeah. Are these on? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you for that presentation. That was really winsome.
Oh, thank you.
It makes me want to read the book again.
I like the word winsome.
Yeah, it's a good word.
Enchanting and winsome. When I get asked what's my favorite word, I often say enchanting. Now I'm going to change it to winsome. I like that.
Tolkien, one of his favorite words was cellar door.
Oh.
He thought it just sounded really great, regardless of the meaning. So try that sometime.
Cellar door.
Cellar
just sounds
door.
like
You
a
love
good
those
way to
L's
show off
and the
my
R's.
lisp.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, cellar door. Well, thank you again for the presentation. When Patti was asking about the title, she wasn't sure about Once Upon a Wardrobe, which I thought was a home run title for this project. I suggested The Lion, the Witch, and the Wimpy Kid, but that didn't go over with you.
He did. He actually emailed that to me.
Yeah, it didn't go over.
It didn't. I sent it off to my editor. She didn't like it either.
Well, my question has to do with your creative process. Sometimes people have a bolt of lightning. Lewis is sitting in church and he says, I want to write a book about a senior devil talking to a junior tempter about how to trip up Christians in their spiritual walk.
I think I know that book.
Yeah, it's pretty well known.
Yeah.
And other people describe the creative process as like making a loaf of bread. You have the ingredients, you mix them together, you knead the dough, you bake them. It's very, I wouldn't say pedestrian, but they know where they're going throughout the project. So for both Becoming Mrs. Lewis and Once Upon a Wardrobe, what is your creative process? Are you sitting on an airplane and you say, I should explore Narnia from the point of view of the little girl whose brother is dying?
I think it's a combo for me. For example, I think this is fascinating. You know, Lewis started The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe 10 years and then picked it up, a decade before he picked it back up. And the opening line, as you know, in his first draft was there were 4 children named
Martin,
Rose, Anne, and Peter. And so when you say that out loud, you go, wait, there were 4 children. That's sort of right, but it's not. There were 4 children named Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. And I don't know what happened to Martin and Anne and Rose and why Peter went from last to first. But, I think that ideas can bubble up like lightning, but the actual process of telling a story is a lot different than the idea arriving. So for this book and for Mrs. Lewis and for Surviving Savannah and whatever it might be, even though the idea bubbles up, the actual process of finding the story, getting to know the characters, seeing the themes arise out of nowhere, going back to strengthen those themes, that is the making of the bread. But yes, the idea to write about Joy Davidman quite literally came out of nowhere. When I said it out loud to a friend of mine who said to me, what would you write about if you could write about anything you wanted? I said, I'd write about Lewis's wife. Fascinating. I didn't even know I'd been thinking about it. I think, and that's what part of Once Upon a Wardrobe is about, is that we can find these little moments, but then there's also all these ineffable, inexplainable, mysterious moments in the story. So the idea for this book probably was brewing ever since I wrote Mrs. Lewis, because I saw all these crumbs in his life. And they were probably back there going, we're a story, we're a story. And I always say that I'm sure I would have eventually written this book, but because of when I was telling you about the pandemic and being at home and using this as a still point, it's probably a much different book than it would have been if I'd written it in the hurry and flurry of regular life.
Do you have a question? Want me to ask another? You mentioned something about being surprised that Lewis was such a storyteller. Some writers, they outline the whole thing. J.K. Rowling famously took out a whole sheet of, a whole roll of shelf paper, and she did all the characters through 7 novels. So when she's halfway through the first novel, she knows that Dumbledore is going to die in the 7th novel.
Wow.
Other people, they don't know where they're going. Tolkien said, who's this
That
fellow
sounds so
Strider?
exhausting, I have to go. I mean, that's like, no, I don't work that way.
Well,
Yeah.
where are you on the spectrum? Tolkien literally would say, who's this guy Strider? Is he human? Is he a hobbit? Is he good or is he bad?
Yeah.
And for him, the creative process was a total time of discovery. So tell me where you are on the spectrum. When you said that Lewis surprised you by telling stories rather than giving exposition about his past.
Oh, wow. I am definitely somewhere in between. And what's fascinating is you chose 2 authors who literally could not be any more successful than anyone you know. So it's such right? So it's such proof that there's not one way to do it.
Right.
So, authors, including me, always want to know, what's your process? Because I want to do it. But we can only be us, the way Crystal does it, the way you do it. Like, you can't try to write the way somebody else writes.
Right.
So if I decided I was going to be more like J.K. Rowling, I mean, I'd like her success, but I couldn't. If I decided to do poster boards on my wall and outline 7 novels, I'd never write the novel. But I'm also not freewheeling it like, I wonder who this character is. So I think I'm a little bit in between. I don't do a lot of outlining, but I do know, here's what I know when I start. What my character wants, why they want it, why they can't get what they want, what misbelief they're carrying around that keeps them from getting what they want. And that misbelief they're going to have to face before they can transform at the end of the novel. And then the rest is a journey of beautiful discovery. I didn't know how Megs was going to finally meet Lewis, but I had her follow him home from school, and that scene unfolded. So for me, it's a little bit of in between those two geniuses. Maybe I should pick one of those geniuses.
Well, that's interesting because even though David and I don't write fiction, although David has written
I was going to say, I
novel.
love his book, the King's Book. I love that book.
Yeah, Looking for the King.
Yeah, I love that.
That has C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and Charles Williams in it. It's for sale in the way. But
My C.S. Lewis can beat up your C.S. Lewis.
Your C.S. Lewis could definitely debate my C.S. Lewis and win.
But even for our scholarship, so I've written 5 scholarly books. David's written,
5 or 6.
6 or 7 scholarly books.
I've
We
written
have-
0 scholarly books.
We have totally opposite styles,
Really?
just like as in the fiction writing of Tolkien and Lewis. So I get this just idea of what I want to say, and I just sit down at the word processor and I just start typing and exploring, and it's almost like my hands are independent entities, and I'm sitting there going, ooh, that's good, hands.
Yeah.
You know, where
Yeah.
did you come up with that? But then I have this mass of material that I have to go back, and the drudgery is editing,
Yes.
rearranging, and every book I write, there's at least half as much, again, material that I have to throw out. That was just part of the exploring process. Whereas my dear husband, he sits, I'm revealing secrets, but he sits and does something that he and his identical twin used to do as little boys. They called bumping. And they'd sit in a chair and just think like this.
Oh my
and
gosh,
he will outline a whole scholarly book in his head. And that is the fun process for him. So by the time he sits down at the word processor, that's drudgery for him, but he never has to revise because he got it all outlined in his head. So we're really good editors for each other because we have such dramatically different writing styles.
A friend of mine, Ariel Lahan, she's a historical writer. She always says the pain, it doesn't matter which way you do it. The pain is either at the beginning or the end.
That's
right?
true.
And you
That's
pick it
true.
at the beginning and you pick it at the end. So either way, we have to edit, refine, clean up. You're just doing it at the beginning, and there's no right way.
That's true. Whenever
do
I'm
it.
typing, I remember why I got a C in typing in high school.
Yep.
My hands won't do what I want them to do.
Okay, I'm going to flip the tables on you all for a minute. So I picked the 7 events I wanted to write. The 7 events I saw not as a scholar, but as a lover of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and of Lewis, and of Joy. I thought about her a lot when I was writing this novel because she has that great quote that life is too intense to be endured with logic alone. And I wanted to put it all in there, but I chose my moments of his life through what I wanted to because I'm the author. I'm curious what events you would have added that show up in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Well, tell us your 7 real quickly so we remember what we're.
Oh, gosh. Okay, so writing in the attic is I don't want to give away the book.
Well, okay. My feeling was, you told me you might ask this question. It's like someone saying, I just won the Super Bowl. How would you have strategized the Super
stop.
Bowl? I go,
No, I just know that
you
you
just
have the...
wrote a best-selling novel
Okay.
based on these 7 memories, and they're perfect.
Okay, then I'll... you told me a story after I finished the book, and it's not in my book. So tell the story. You're fairly sure Lewis would have known this story about the white stag.
Oh, that's right. Well, there's
Yeah.
at the end of The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, they're hunting the white stag, and there's this idea that if you catch him, then you get one wish, and that's a part of Irish folklore that he grew up with.
That he would have known.
Yeah, and there really is a herd of deer in Ireland called the White Deer of Mallow. It's a whole herd, including the stags. And the most famous story is that a cottager named Sean O'Kiley catches the white stag, and he says, I've caught you, I'm not going to let you go until you grant me one wish. And the white stag says, well, fair enough. And what's your one wish? And Sean says, well, let me think about it. This is an important decision. So he goes home to his family and says, I caught the white stag. I get one wish. What should it be? And his father says, well, I'm too old to work, and I don't really have any plan for retirement. I would think we would, want some kind of money for my retirement. And Sean says, oh, that's good, that's good. And then his mother says, well, I'm losing my sight. I would think that you would want the wish to be about my having my sight restored. And Sean goes, oh, that's also good. And his wife says, well, we've been trying to start a family and haven't succeeded. I would think your wish would be that we'd be able to have a child. And Sean says, oh, that's also good. And so he spends all night tossing and turning, trying to decide what to say to the stag in the morning. Finally, at sunrise, he gets this restful thought and falls back and gets a little bit of sleep. And then he goes to the white stag. And he says, I'm going to let you go if you grant me one wish. And the white stag, yes, that's the deal. What is your one wish? And Sean O'Reilly says, I just wish that my mother could see my newborn child rocking in a cradle of gold. So that's the old Irish folklore that I'm sure
but
Lewis
then
was
he
aware
takes
of.
this one thing he probably grew up with, and it shows up in The Lion, the Witch, and the
Right,
Wardrobe.
yeah, they're hunting the white stag.
Yeah.
Right.
So how about you? Can you think of anything?
No, I am not a Lewis scholar. I know that one incident that I would try to impose into the novel, since I'm a Dorothy Sayers scholar, is I would like to have Lewis remember somehow and integrate the first letter he got from Dorothy Sayers.
Oh, I know, so cool.
Which is she wrote in the voice of a senior demon called Sluckdrib about this series of radio plays that Sayers had written, and talked about the response to these radio plays called The Man Born to be King. And it's just delightfully imaginative, and at the end, Sayers puts in her own words, you need to handle these people who keep writing me about Christian theology. You like souls. I don't.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. So what year was that letter?
1943.
Okay, so when the paperback comes out, we're going to have a stag and a Dorothy Sayers letter. I'm adding them. We're going to have a bonus chapter.
But
Good.
what's interesting about that is C.S. Lewis so loved these, the published version of these radio plays by Dorothy Sayers, that he read them every year for his Lenten devotions till the year he died. And when he was asked near his death who influenced his spiritual life the most, he named 4 people, and one was Dorothy Sayers, because of these radio plays.
It's amazing.
So Lewis was having his devotions reading Dorothy Sayers' radio plays while he was writing Narnia.
Okay, we're going to add that. See, I knew you would have some great ideas. And
You think
people
Mrs.
have asked
Beaver-
me.
You think Mrs. Beaver is based on Dorothy Sayers? No, probably not.
No, probably not. Maybe.
She's the one who said that
Hope it's
Aslan
not
is
the White
safe,
Witch.
but he's good.
Yeah, it's not safe, but he's good. Hope it's not the White Witch. No, she's Cersei, I think.
I have another
That's just my
question for
guess.
you.
Okay.
You, in a previous life, you were a pediatric nurse, and I'm wondering how much the psychology of the terminally ill child and the whole family trying to deal with that and be positive and support him, and yet in the back of their mind, there's this just unspeakable sadness.
Uncertainty.
Yeah, how much did your background as a pediatric nurse come into the family dynamic in this story?
That's real. I didn't think about it till you mentioned it earlier today. And I think it goes back to what part of this book is about, is that sometimes these unconscious parts of our life show up in stories. And I did have to, I was a pediatric nurse for a long while. A lot of times when people ask me if I wish I'd gone to journalism school or MFA, I say no, because I believe that being a nurse, especially where I was at a children's hospital, is no greater education in the human condition. You see people at their most
Right.
broken. You don't see them at their most fancy, like in, college in the ivory tower.
Right,
No, I'm kidding.
right.
But I think, dealing with broken family dynamics, I often say that being an author is often like being a pretend psychoanalyst, right? Where are the broken places? Where do they need to be healed? How did their past influence this? And so, without giving a spoiler, the father is very resistant to engaging with what's happening because of not being able to deal with it. And these are things I saw in the world back in the day. So, I didn't really think about it till you asked that, but I'm sure it did for sure.
Well, the psychology is very believable and very touching. And I had a feeling that you were able to, writing a story about a child who's terminally ill, you could easily err in one direction or the other, sentimental.
Maudlin, sentimental,
right.
saccharine. Yeah.
But I love the way you handled that situation. And her whole project in some ways is I would do anything for my brother, even approach C.S. Lewis and try to get all these stories. So I loved her motivation because it's out of love for her brother. It's not just intellectual curiosity. So it's a novel that has a lot of intellectual depth. People ask me, what should I read about Lewis's background as it explains Narnia? And rather than mentioning a reference source, I say, read this novel, read Once Upon a Wardrobe.
There's
That'll give you
also
as
a
much
really
insight.
great book I read when I was writing this book called Into the Wardrobe by Dr. David C. Downing. That book
That's
is
also a good book.
That's also a good one.
Yeah.
So
It's not been reviewed yet in the Washington Post. I'm waiting for the review to come
I'll
out.
give them a little ringy ding.
Good.
Maybe we should pause and
Okay.
see if someone out there has a question, if you want to make your way to one of the microphones so that we...
Or scream it at us. I don't know. Either way. I'm sure we can hear you. Gosh, I cannot wait until we're all in a room smushed up together without masks on.
I know.
Can I get an amen?
Amen.
Thank
right.
you. I can't tell if you're smiling at me or frowning at me.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, this woman over here.
Your voice is so, I love listening to your voice when you do the Friends and Fictions and everything. Have you ever thought about doing the audiobooks? I haven't listened to any.
Oh my gosh, what a nice thing to
But have
say.
you ever thought about doing that? Or
Are you one of our Friends in Fiction girls? Oh, do I have friends in fiction? Ladies, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Where's Sharon? Sharon here? Hi, Sharon. You told me you were coming. Have I ever thought about doing my own audio? Oh, good Lord, no. No, and thank you for saying that, but first of all, the reader for this book is incredible. She is an actress named Fiona Hardingham. And actually, I think I'll post tomorrow because I have an audiogram of her reading it. And she's extraordinary. But reading your own book is really hard. I've read my author notes and things like that. But for example, this book needed a British accent. And it would have sounded Jamaican because I don't know how to have a British accent. I've tried. It comes out like Caribbean or I don't know. So, I've read my author notes, but Audible and audiobooks have grown more in the past decade, in the past 5 years, and definitely during the pandemic, faster than almost any other book source. And they're hiring actresses now, like famous actresses, instead of even just voice actresses. I have an Audible original about Florence Nightingale called Wild Swan, and Cynthia Erivo reads it. I mean, she is a Broadway star. She won a Tony for The Color Purple. She plays Aretha Franklin in the new movie. She's incredible. And they called me and they said, Cynthia Erivo is reading your book. I was like, it can't be the same one. But it was. So it's become very much a big industry. So I doubt anyone will ever ask me. But that is such a nice compliment, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. I have a little lisp. So, yes, ma'am.
Could you describe a little bit about your journey from pediatric nurse to becoming a writer?
Sure. So when I was growing, you have to go even back a little bit further to jump to being a writer, because I grew up as a bookworm nerd, or I should leave out the word nerd. I grew up a total bookworm. I used to get in trouble for reading. Did anybody here get in trouble? My people are here. I mean, like, get your nose out of that book, join us here in the real world, that kind of thing. But I never thought about being a writer because to me, the books were the living things. The writers were just on the flaps. I didn't think about the person who wrote them. And growing up when I did, and, looking at colleges in the late 70s and early 80s, the question I got was, do you want to be a nurse, a teacher, or a secretary, right? And I really did want to be a nurse. I loved being a nurse. But then, all these different kind of flashpoints happened in my life. If I look back, I see them as stepping stones that I didn't understand at the time. But I wrote books before when I could hold a crayon. I would type them on my dad's typewriter and they were gobbledygook. And then I would put the covers on them and draw pictures and put "By Patti." And like I said, I joined the Latin club because I was obsessed with words and mythology. We moved a lot when I was a kid. Right around from about 12 to 16, we moved. I went to 4 or 5 different schools. And there's nothing worse than I had anxiety today because I ate in the cafeteria. Like, where do you put your tray at lunch? Like, who do you sit with, right? And so I would hide in the library and I would read, and I was constantly fascinated by stories. And I remember sitting in the library and thinking I could be 1,000 years old and I could never read every single book in here. But I still didn't think about being an author until, we're going to flash forward, I went to graduate school, I was married, I had 3 kids in 5 years, and I was playing dollhouse with my 5-year-old. And she had a 3-year-old brother and a newborn brother. So these are large chunks of my life I don't remember. But I remember this. I was playing dollhouse, and I said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And she's now married and has 2 of her own kids. But she said, "I want to be a writer of books." And it was just such an innocent statement. She didn't say, "I want to be a best-selling author," or even the word author. She just said, "I want to be a writer of books." And I knew why she said it. And she said it because that was her only alone time with me. One more book. And so I fired right back at her, and I said, "No, that's what I want to be when I grow up." And she said, "You're already grown up." And I signed up for writing classes at Emory Night School the next day. So that's where it started. And I just wanted to see if I could do this thing that had sustained me for my whole life. I just wanted to see if I could write one book and do this thing that defined my life and sustained my life. And that was 16 books ago. And that book was not published, by the way.
This young man, can you reach the mic?
So where do you get all your characters from?
Where do I get my characters from? My imagination, which is the mystery of stories. Do you like to write and read? So do you sometimes think of characters in your head? Do they just appear? Right? Our imagination is so holy and divine and mysterious and mystical, because how does a character just grow out of our imagination? And and I know you guys will probably have a great answer for this too, but one of the things C.S. Lewis says is that imagination is our organ of meaning. Meaning, our imagination is how we make meaning of things. So it is meant to be used and make up characters. And I think the more we do it, the more they grow. So when you sit down to write a story about a little boy or a little girl or a grown-up you imagine, or a dragon or a monster or whatever it is, they start to grow in your imagination and on your pages. So that's where they come from. The best answer to that? I don't know.
This woman over here.
I had a different question in mind before I heard your answer. That's such a beautiful story about your origin story as an author. I wonder, 16 books later, what advice would you give to your younger self when you were just starting out?
Oh, wow, that's such a good question. You can tell she's a writer, right? What advice would I give to myself if I could go back?
I would say invest in Facebook.
Yeah, right. Invest in Facebook, get on Instagram early. I would really tell myself, number one, to be patient, right? Because when you're writing that first book, you really think it's going to be the only book you'll ever write. You can't imagine there'll be more. And I think I would tell myself, to be patient, slow down. It is a lifelong journey of story learning. It's not like nursing school where you read the books and you learn about, science is never ending also, but you graduate from nursing school and then you graduate and write your thesis from graduate school. There's no such thing in this writing journey. You are constantly, which is part of why Allison and I ate together tonight, and you asked me if Friends in Fiction was nourishing or exhausting or what it was, and it's so nourishing because all we do is talk about books and stories and publishing and talk to other authors and other readers, and that's the stuff that nourishes me. But craft-wise, I would have told myself I was just describing about asking what my character wants, why they want it, why they can't get it. That took me a little bit longer than that kind of solid truth. I wish I would have known a little bit earlier.
Can you explain, Patti, what Friends in Fiction is?
Oh, sure.
People out here may not understand.
Absolutely. So during the pandemic, 4 author pals and I got together because all of our book tours had been canceled. Right now, there's 4 of us, and it is Mary Kay Andrews, Kristen Harmel, who writes amazing, beautiful historical fiction, and Christy Woodson Harvey. And originally Mary Alice Monroe was part of it. And we all got together because we all had book tours canceled in March. And Mary Kay, who is bar none, I'm not insulted by this, the funniest one of us, called and said, let's all get on a Zoom and whine with wine. And we did, and we had so much fun. She said, we should put this on Facebook Live because I think our readers would think what we're talking about is interesting. I was like, yeah, that's going to work. And we put it on her Facebook page, and I think it's archived somewhere, but her daughter is running tech, and you can see her crawling around on the floor. And she is wearing this gorgeous purple silk shirt, which is her pajamas. Because we didn't think anybody would show up, and they did. And we did it from her page for a couple weeks. And then we thought, a lot of people are showing up. We should get our own page. So we started a Facebook page called Friends and Fiction. And every Wednesday night, our 100th show is coming up. I know, I love y'all so much. And this amazing community grew up out of this idea that we just thought we were doing for fun, but this idea that we need to be together to talk about stories, that we need to be together to talk about what those stories mean to us, especially when we were in lockdown. And we thought we were hot potatoes when we had 500 members, and now there are 54,000 members now. Every week we interview another author, whether it's Kristen Hanna, Delia Owens, some of your very favorite authors we have interviewed. And we also have a book club. It's called the Friends in Fiction Official Book Club, run by 2 of our pals, Lisa Harrison and Brenda Gardner. And they pick a book a month, and you can get on there and talk about spoilers, and they have a book club. We have a podcast. Not only is the show a podcast, but we partnered with a librarian. We did it to support independent bookstores and libraries. And just this beautiful community has grown up around it. We are live on Facebook and YouTube every Wednesday night, and everything is archived on YouTube. So probably some of your favorite authors have been interviewed. So thanks for asking. It's a really extraordinary community.
How about a supplemental program called Enemies in Fiction about people you don't like? Would that be?
That's a private book club.
Oh, that's private. Okay.
Trust me, we have it.
This woman over here.
Yes.
So this is kind of a similar question to the one that was just asked, but how do you deal with writing discouragement and writer's block? And do you have any tips for writing in college, even when you're very busy?
Oh, wow. That's a lot of big, big questions. So I'm going to start with the writer's block. I need to not believe in it. Because, and by that what I mean is, I can find 1 million excuses not to write. And I can tell when I'm stuck because I alphabetize my spices, I clean out my closet. But for me, what I get is is a story block more than writer's block, because I love to write and I love to be inside my stories, but sometimes I don't know where those stories are going. So it's more story block for me than writer's block. And for that, the only cure, and it sounds trite, but the only cure is to write straight through it. And I think part of our problem, and I know it was mine in college, is that, and this even goes back to Allison's question about what I would tell myself, we believe that everything we write needs to be right the first time, and it doesn't. Sometimes we're just clearing our throat on the page or finding our way, and it doesn't matter. Nobody has to ever read those pages, but they're the pages we need to get through to get to the next pages, and that's okay. And I think there's a great quote by Somerset Maugham that says, "There are 3 secrets to writing, but sadly, no one knows what they are." So I think, I always say, and what I wish I would have known was that the secret is there is no secret. And so it's just plowing through. And then how to find time when you're busy in college. You're always going to be busy. I saw this great meme the other day that said, adulthood is just one day after another saying, when things slow down, I'll get to that, right? So for me, I started writing when my kids were 5, 3, and newborn, like I said. And I always answer that question with I make time. I don't care if it's 15 minutes. I don't care if it's 30 minutes. I don't care if it's 5 minutes. A book can be written in 15-minute increments. It's about carving out this sacred time that's just for that. That's only for that. And when I first started writing, I didn't have the distraction y'all have now, where you can check your email, your Instagram, your Snapchat, your Facebook, But if you can carve out sacred time, you won't believe how much can grow out of that fertile soil. So I hope that helps.
We'll have to have this be our last question. We are having so much fun, but we want
I was going to say, wait, you're going to end the party? Okay, go ahead.
We want time so that you can purchase Patti's book and get her autograph to it out in the foyer. So why don't you give us our last question?
Well, thank you for taking it. I think my question stems from an earlier part of the presentation where we talked about the quote, if people are old enough to read fairy tales. And I can see how this book might encourage people to read Narnia, but I wonder if you had any other encouragement. I'd like my older kids to revisit Narnia, and I'd like to maybe write something in the front of the book to give it to them.
Oh, wow. I think who can do better than Lewis? I mean, I would just, and actually the dedication in the front of the book for me, I wrote it, dedicated it to my 3-year-old granddaughter named Bridget. And I said, may you never, ever, ever be too old for fairy tales. I don't know. What would y'all say? What would you put in the front of a book to encourage reading?
Well, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, doesn't he dedicate to Lucy Barfield and say,
Yeah.
when I started this book, you were a little girl, but now you may feel you're too old to read fairy tales, but may you continue to grow until you will go back and reclaim them. The quote you mentioned earlier, Lewis wrote in a letter, age and youth only touch the surface of our lives. When I was 12, part of me was already 50, and now that I'm 50, parts of me are still 12.
Yeah.
So I think he definitely would say something about finding the child in yourself when you read
I like
children's
that.
fiction. Yeah.
And the other quote I like of his is that, and I will mangle it, and if Andrew Lazo was here, he would correct me. But sometimes fairy stories say best what needs to be said.
Right.
And I really like that too. So Okay, y'all are amazing for coming out on this night. I saw that rain and that cold. I was like, wow, the three of us are going to have a great discussion amongst ourselves. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Wade Center. I love this campus. I love the Wade Center. I hold a really special place in my heart for this place, and I'm so happy that you joined me. And if you didn't get to ask something, I'll be right out there. So thanks, y'all.